on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am pleased to welcome on Free to Choose Friday the Rose Scholar in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Angela Rachidi. Angela, welcome to the show. It's good to talk with you.
Great. Thank you, Jimmy. Great to be on.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate you joining us. So I want to just ask you a broad question because obviously we're facing this pandemic. Millions of people are out of work, many who've never been out of work before, particularly because of these government-determined shutdowns. So there are two things going on. One was really the question of where poverty was at in America in, say, January, February of this year and where we are now. Can you give us a big picture understanding of both?
Yeah, sure. And it's actually, it's kind of unfortunate that unfortunate broadly what's happened, but especially when it comes to poverty, because if you look over the past few years and even the past few decades, we were actually making quite a bit of progress on poverty. Poverty rates, when properly measured, and I can talk about that briefly, when properly measured, poverty rates in the United States were at the lowest level in the past 3 decades, and by some measures, the lowest on record since the 1960s. So I say that, though, about when properly measured, because there's really two stories going on with poverty in the United States. So one is based on what we call the official poverty measure, which basically just measures income mostly from earnings that people have in their household. When you look at that poverty measure, poverty in the United States has basically remained flat since the 1960s. But when you use another measure, which factors in government benefits that households receive, that's where we've seen this very large and pretty sustained decline since the 1960s, as I mentioned, but most from the most recent declines have been from the 1990s. And much of that is attributed to the very big transformation in our welfare programs, which we call welfare reform in the 1990s. So kind of a mixed story. Historically, the lowest poverty rates on record when you factor in government benefits going into households. But when you don't factor in those government benefits and really just think about what people are earning on their own, poverty's basically been flat.
So why is it so important then to make sure that you're using the right metrics, or how do you apply those particular metrics when you want to affect public policy? I mean, obviously, if you were to just pick one or the other, it will give you an incomplete picture.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's actually a question we struggle with quite a lot from the research world. And it really does have important implications. And the reason is it really informs what the right policies are to try to reduce poverty. And I think that's obviously the goal of most policymakers, is to try to reduce poverty. But when you think about what are those right policies, obviously, I mean, it's just common sense that if you transfer a lot of income from the government, which is really taxpayer money, if you transfer money from taxpayers to low-income households, poverty is going to be reduced. But then the question is, how do you encourage self-sufficiency and encourage people to exit poverty through their own personal responsibility, their own effort? So that's why these two measures are so important. So if you're only focused on the measure where government benefits are included, you see this large decline, but it's largely because of these transfer programs that we have in this country. And from a policy perspective, like I said, you can easily transfer money if you have the money. So that requires increasing taxes, making cuts other places, and it's not clear if that's sustainable, which is why we need to also focus on the other measure, which again measures whether people are able to get out of poverty on their own.
So Angela Rachidi from the American Enterprise Institute, when we look at this issue then of the two numbers, two different metrics, where are we at right now in the society today, or at least where were we as of the latest data prior to this pandemic as far as both metrics?
Right. So we've done as a country a fairly good job addressing the needs of low-income families in terms of transferring income. So that's where we've seen these large declines. And the transferring of income has really come from two very large federal programs. The Earned Incomes Tax Credit, which goes to working families with children. It comes once a year around tax time, and it's a few $1,000s for families with children. And the other one is what we call the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly called food stamps. And that's also been a very large investment from the federal government to transfer dollars to low-income families. So when you factor in those very large programs, we've done a pretty good job in at least helping the material or reducing the material hardship of low-income families. But what we haven't done such a great job at is really addressing the underlying causes of poverty, which are limited work, single parent families, kind of the decline of our communities in supporting each other. And that's where I think there is much more that can be done, not only at the federal level, but also at the community and family level.
And one thing that I think the best poverty research and poverty alleviation research has done is demonstrate the importance and value of work, especially when you're not just saying, hey, we can alleviate the material needs, but actually bring you out of poverty. And that was the basis, of course, of the welfare reforms that you mentioned, Angela, in the 1990s. Talk to us a little bit about the role that work plays in bringing people out of poverty.
Oh, sure. I mean, employment, work is the number one factor that determines poverty. And that seems obvious because income is what poverty, or a lack of sufficient income is what poverty is. But it really is worth emphasizing that employment is the number one way to reduce poverty. And when we look at data and you look at the poverty rates among people who do not work, it's just, I mean, the poverty rates among households that do not have a worker in it are 4 times that of households that have workers in it. And actually, if you have a household that has one full-time worker for the entire year, the odds of being in poverty for that household are extremely low. I mean, it's less than 5%. So, and I don't want to minimize that, because we do know that employment is difficult for some households, and there's a lot of factors that go into why people can't find sustained employment. But from a policy perspective, employment really is key, and our policies should all be aimed at trying to increase that full-time, full-year employment among households.
It's interesting, too, because there was a poll from the Cato Institute that came out last fall that said that 77% of those polled said that government efforts to fight poverty have been ineffective. And that suggests that there's an understanding, I think, growing among Americans that you cannot simply look to government programs to lift people out of poverty. You actually have to see that the environmental circumstances of the economy are bolstered in a way that benefits from the free enterprise system and provides incentives for businesses to hire workers, as opposed to just saying, hey, let's offload them onto these government doles.
Yes, and we have survey data that we've done at AEI that tell us the exact same thing. And we actually hear that from poor populations as well. They also do not feel that these government programs have been very effective at addressing their needs. And the reason is because many of our government programs actually undermine employment. The government programs in place, the large safety net programs, again, are largely around trying to make poverty less, or trying to make it more comfortable for people, rather than trying to help people help themselves get out of poverty. And I think that that distinction is really important. And that's why we hear from many people, including poor people, that the programs do not seem very effective, because again, it's just trying to make their situation more comfortable, rather than trying to really help them get out of that situation and do better for their families. And I think that's where our policies should really be focused.
There was a fascinating documentary that the now former president of AEI, Arthur Brooks, came out with last year, I think it was, that really zeroed in on the problem of poverty and how it's been alleviated across the globe, especially in India, where he traveled to. And he noted in that documentary that 350 million fewer Indians are in absolute poverty today than otherwise would have been if not for India opening up to a more free enterprise system over the past 3 to 4 decades. And I think that's so fundamental, because that's the story here in the United States of when we've had our greatest prosperity points, when we've had our fewest numbers of people in poverty. That's been when we've seen the greatest opportunity coming from the free market.
Yes, it's very true. And I have learned a great deal from Arthur Brooks and him looking at these other countries. And he's exactly right. I mean, free enterprise, capitalism, that has been the number one poverty reducing policy across the world in the past several decades, but really in the most recent years in developing countries. And I do think we can draw some really important lessons from that because obviously we're not in the same place, but it does really emphasize the importance of our capitalist society and really building on that and using that as a catalyst to reduce poverty in this country.
Exactly. So, in terms of the welfare reforms of the 90s, we hear a lot of critics who say that that was not the way to go, that these work requirements are too strenuous, and that essentially what conservatives were doing when they had the opportunity to sort of manipulate Democrat President Bill Clinton to pass welfare reform in the 90s was throw people into a more difficult situation, was uncaring, not compassionate. How do you respond to that criticism based on what the data show?
I've always had a very hard time with that criticism. So I started my career working in New York City in 2000, which was when New York City was implementing welfare reforms. So I had the opportunity to have firsthand knowledge and observations of people moving from that system of where it was welfare, which was just a handout to them, to a system where there were some expectations that people would work in exchange for their benefits. And I never experienced what many of the critics talk about in terms of people just thrown out there to fend for themselves. People appreciated the opportunity to receive support so that they could go out and work. And I think that that policy was the defining moment in terms of our welfare history. And from my perspective, looking at the data, looking at the research, looking, like I said, at the substantial poverty declines we've seen in the past couple of decades, was the right policy, and we should be building on it instead of trying to roll it back.
I couldn't agree more. Angela Rachidi, she is our guest from the American Enterprise Institute, Rose Scholar in Poverty Studies there. Just a few minutes left, and coming up in the next segment, we're going to be talking with the great professor, Dr. Walter E. Williams, and we're going to dive in a little bit into race and economics and that side of things. But one of the things that I know he likes to talk about is not just policies that we need to have in place to encourage and incentivize employment, but also the importance of getting government out of the way in so many circumstances. I mean, the virtue of the free enterprise system is not just that you have incentives for people to do things, but you're not blocking incentives for them to take certain actions, such as hiring workers. Talk to us a little bit about that and the role that government impediments can play in making it more difficult to bring people out of poverty.
Oh, there are many, and I focused much of my work on those disincentives that are built into our programs because those probably bother me the worst because I've heard from people that say, I am trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to do what is expected of me, and the government is getting in the way. And those are things like marriage penalties. So some of our programs are more generous if you have two parents who remain unmarried rather than getting married, which I think it is really just a ridiculous policy. And the second is employment disincentives. And we have many programs where if you try to earn more or gain more hours, you are at risk of losing what benefits you have. And it's a fine line because you don't want to provide benefits to people who can provide for themselves, but there needs to be a way to design policies so that people can really feel like they are better off when they're working than when they're receiving benefits.
And finally, Angela, bottom line, when you're talking to Americans across the country, when you do symposiums or have conversations or wherever you're conversing with people, what are the points that you like to get across the most, sort of the top line key things people need to keep in mind regarding poverty?
Yeah, that's another really good question. The one thing I always try to emphasize is that low income people are really no different than middle and higher income people in the sense that they have a desire to work and they have a desire to provide for their families. And so I try to emphasize that in just what we were talking about, government needs to recognize that they want to work and actually facilitate that employment for them rather than getting in the way. And I think way too often we have people who think that they're advocating for low income populations when really they're just holding them back rather than giving them the opportunities and the tools that they need to do better for their families.
Absolutely. Angela Rachidi, Rose Scholar in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much for joining us on this Free to Choose Friday and helping to set the table. So much great work you guys are doing at AEI in regards to poverty especially. So thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Jimmy.
Thank you. Have a good weekend and stay healthy. Once again, Angela Rachidi joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And they really are. I mean, what Arthur Brooks has done when he was president of AEI, and now they've got a new president there. We talked a couple weeks ago with a guest from the Washington Examiner about what he's doing. There's a big emphasis on addressing the problem of poverty. And I thought, hey, AEI would be great at helping us to set the table here, as it were, on this Free to Choose Friday. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.